Guys, is the Russian economy about to get boofed? And how bad is it going to impact their ability to wage war? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's do it. Okay, first, when we look at the tactical map, you guys can see that the huge offensives across the front line have ebbed in some places, but have actually continued outside Donetsk city. You can see these attacks are persisting, but they remain very dispersed in Marinka, Krasnyova, Avdiivka. But when you disperse your forces like this, you just never really are able to effectively concentrate your forces sufficiently to actually break enemy lines. And that's what we're seeing here. Ukrainians are very thoroughly dug in. And these efforts by what I think actually, I suspect this is largely the DNR, LNR, but it could also be supported by Russian Ministry of Defense forces who probably are repositioned at this point from Kherson and are starting to be deployed in other places on the front. But either way, we're just not seeing the gains that I think you would otherwise see if Russia were able to concentrate its forces. And some of this is their failure of command and control, but I think the Ukrainian artillery and rocket forces also deserve a lot of the credit. Their ability to find concentrations of enemy troops and disperse them, we'll say, before they can really achieve a high level of concentration, it really goes a long way towards facilitating the breakup of these any major offensive efforts that they attempt. You can see one brief attack outside of Soledar near Bakhmut, and that's pretty much it for Russian ground offensives in this conflict. But that's not the real news of the day, right? The real story, of course, is the price cap. Now, this sounds sort of silly, and I agree it kind of is. So Europe sort of finds itself in a tough position vis-a-vis Russian oil because some countries don't really feel like they have a dog in the fight of Ukraine and Russia. Obviously, the U.S. does, Europe does, but countries like China, India, and other developing nations, they don't really have a stake in the outcome, but they do have a stake in the outcome of the ability to get fuel in their cars, to get oil in their refineries, etc. And so they're stuck with this situation where Europe knows that whatever sanctions it places on Russia are only going to partially impact the country's ability to sell oil abroad. And this becomes a problem because let's say they choose to say, we refuse to buy Russian oil. What's going to happen to the price of oil? Globally, it's going to go up very high. And Russia can still sell their oil to other people at this now elevated price. So by banning Russian oil, it actually runs the risk of empowering Russia and funneling more money into their coffers. And so they realize that the better solution to this, right, is not to also, they can't buy Russian oil in mass because that's also silly. It's fueling the Russian war machine while simultaneously sending arms to Ukraine to destroy the Russian war machine. You're rowing in two opposing directions. And so what the European Union settled on is actually kind of crafty. It's a price cap where they say, hey, we'll buy your oil, and $60 a barrel is still profitable, especially given where the ruble is. But we'll buy it only at 60 USD a barrel. And this way, they are helping to depress the price of oil globally while not necessarily maximizing the revenue they're giving to the Russian state oil industry. This is an interesting call. I'll be curious to know if Russia even chooses to sell this oil. They're pretty desperate, so they may actually elect to sell it at $60 a barrel. But by having this glut of underpriced oil in the global trade, it's going to help depress the free market price of oil. Sort of like how if someone was giving away lemonade, if your neighbor was giving away lemonade, you wouldn't be able to charge for it at your lemonade stand, or you'd have to charge way less at your lemonade stand. So is this going to be a sustainable solution, or is this more of a a feel-good move. And there's debate, right? It's tough to model. The best analysts in the world have a hard time modeling the global oil market. And it's going to depend in part on Russia's response, right? Are they going to take their toys, go home, and say they're only going to sell oil to, say, India or China? Are they going to try to circumvent this? It depends. One notable carve-out is that you notice here it says the European Union countries agreed on Friday to cap the maritime trade of Russian oil, which is interesting because it implies that any Russian oil that flows over pipelines can be traded at market rates, which maybe gives Russia an out, maybe punishes Russia in some ways for blowing up Nord Stream 2. It's not really super clear yet on what this carve-out means, other than that the European Union realizes it really needs to buy a lot of heating oil for the coming winter, and Russia is basically the only source in the market that can do that right now. And so, all in all, I think the loser here is going to still be Putin. He's still going to have a harder time selling his wares. But what I think is also really interesting is that, let's see if we can find it back here. Let's go we'll go to ground news and see if we can find the other Ukraine story. By the way, guys, you should definitely take a look at ground news. I always keep the link in the description. They've been they're a good sponsor of the channel, but they're a good sponsor because they're a great service. As you guys can see, here is their summary of another story where Russia's response saying the price cap is dangerous and won't curb demand for our oil. And you can see, we know this story is fairly legit, that Russia's really saying these things, because you can see the diversity of outlets that are covering the story, from Reuters to the Epic Times to they're slightly left of center, more centrist, Deccan Herald and SWI. You can see that obviously Russia's public statements are being amplified more by the right-wing media, but it still is almost certainly true. And what I find most interesting is that Russia says something that's true, but not necessarily relevant, right? It's not super clear on how it's dangerous, but they say it will not curb demand for our oil. And this is true. Price cap, according to economic theory and modeling, a price cap isn't going to impact the demand curve, right? Everyone still wants to heat their house at certain price points and put gas in their car. But it will reduce the revenues or the supply of the oil, right? At $60 a barrel, Russia might not be willing to sell oil sufficient to meet demand. And so you still will have a shortage, but you won't have market price. You won't have a meeting between market pricing. So technically true, but the fact that Russia is encouraging European Union countries not to do this is probably a sign that it really is going to deal a little damage. Anyway, guys, that is really it for today's update. As always, thank you guys so much for joining me. And of course, if you want access to the combat video breakdowns that are YouTube will not let me show you, the latest one just dropped yesterday. It's on the Patreon. The link to that's in the description. Thanks to my Lieutenant tier patrons. You guys are the ones who make this possible. I'll see you all in the next one.